So we're going to talk about offensive counterinterps, and we're going to practice making arguments why OCIs are good, why OCIs are bad, and when something is a counterinterp versus an interp. So first, briefly, the big picture overview here is what is an OCI? An OCI is an offensive counterinterp. So it's the difference between saying, let's say we're having a spec good bad debate. So the negative reads a shell saying the affirmative may not specify a country in which we implement living wages. An counterinterpretation normally would say the affirmative may specify a country in which we give living wages.
Right.
An offensive interpretation could, counterinterpretation could look like one of two or three things. First is you could say the negative may not contest whether the affirmative can specify a country. It can also look like the AF must specify a country. Now the difference between those two offensive interps is one puts a prohibition on what the negative may do, and one puts obligation on what the AF must do. So underneath AF must specify a country, you would say that the violation is the negative doesn't let me do so by reading a theory shell. Underneath neg may not prohibit me from specifying a country, violation's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people say that offensive counterinterpretations are arbitrary. What they mean is this. Let's say we take the offensive counterinterpretation, the negative may not prohibit me from specifying a country. And then you give a bunch of reasons why specifying a country is good. None of those reasons explained why the neg can't prohibit it. It just explained why specking a country is good.
Sure.
So none of the offense in the theory shell linked back to the plank of the interpretation that was about neg prohibition. So to illustrate its arbitrariness, a thought experiment could be we could substitute the neg may not prohibit me to the AF may specify.
Sure, yeah.
So the fact that we could substitute those two phrases into the counterinterpretation and the counterinterpretation offense and the standards would not change indicates the arbitrary nature of the plank that's being included on the offensive counterinterp, making it offensive. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there's no offense back to the neg may not prohibit me to do this. Now, if there were to be offense back to that, what would it look like? It would look like one of several things. A is the norming argument. That if I win the counterinterpretation is a good norm. And if we're concerned about having the best norms in debate, the negative should not advocate for bad norms.
Okay.
And then B is the RVI arguments.
Sure.
That if I win the counterinterpretation, the negative may not prohibit me because then it's just wasting my time. And it's creating an irreciprocal layer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, I think that though some people try to make the norming argument independent of the RVI arguments, the norming argument ultimately is just an RVI argument.
Really?
I think so. I mean, I'm not super sold on that they are one and the same, but it seems like ultimately like one good reason for reverse voting issues is that it deters frivolous theory, i.e. it creates the norm of you don't read bad arguments for the purpose of creating a no-risk issue.
I think the distinction is that the norming argument for the OCI is that negative shouldn't advocate for a bad norm, but for the RVI it's just more of a frivolous theory.
Right, and I mean, presumably the frivolous theory norm
right.
would rely on you winning that their norm was a bad norm.
Right, yeah.
Right? Like for you to win the frivolous theory argument on the RVI, you have to win the interp counterinterp debate. And so if you win the interp counterinterp debate, you have established that they were reading frivolous theory,
Right.
i.e. that it was a bad norm.
Sure, yeah.
So it seems like the frivolous theory argument is the same as norming, it's just packaged in different words.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
That's what makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. So ultimately what we see then is that with offensive counterinterpretations, the plank that makes them offensive, if the plank is to be not arbitrary, then it would just essentially appeal to an RVI.
Okay.
So this is what people mean by OCIs make zero sense.
Okay.
That OCIs beg the question of whether or not we should have RVIs. Now, one thing here is that the jargon can sometimes become very annoying. to deal with, right? Especially when someone's spreading and I'm flowing. Like, if you just start rambling about OCIs and RVIs, all of a sudden there's a lot of acronyms that are being thrown about, right? So you have to make sure that you're A, using the acronyms correctly, and B, making sure your judge is following along. That means looking at them while you're giving the speech.
Okay.
We saw this in the round between
Danny and Jessica.
Danny and Jessica, where Danny was looking at his judge and told their judges, or his judges, that, look, if you don't understand where I'm at, look up and I'll signpost clearly. Right? And that indicates that he's looking at them at all times.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, what makes an OCI arbitrary, I think, is clear. And what we need to discuss next, then, is the impact to it being arbitrary. Because if you read an OCI and you bite the bullet and you're like, yeah, this is arbitrary, but so what?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That brings up an important point, which is a lot of people stop at it's arbitrary, but then don't give reasons why arbitrariness is bad.
Sure.
Like, the A point is arbitrariness kills norming, right? We create awful norms when we create arbitrary norms. There's no consistency within the norms. There's no way we can have an output that makes sense to us. In terms of what rules are being created.
Sure.
I think the B point is that arbitrary planks are unfair. It means that one side is winning for no reason.
Okay.
The point of debate is to accurately determine the winner, and we normally cannot do so in arbitrary rounds. Like, arbitrariness seems to cut against the core of objectivity.
Okay.
Like, it can't be an objectively valid decision if it was arbitrary.
Okay.
By definition, almost. Does that make sense? Cool. So remember when you're saying this is an OCI, don't vote off OCIs because they're arbitrary, to include a one-sentence argument for why arbitrariness is bad.
Sure, yeah.
Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if we've established that it is almost always an awful idea to go for OCIs, unless your judge explicitly says in their paradigms they believe in OCIs, right? In which case, go wild. Like, just make your interp offensive, right? If we've established it's a bad idea to go for that, then we also need to have a long conversation about what makes something an interp versus a counterinterp.
Right.
Because the benefit to an OCI, the reason people want the OCI, is so that they can get offense on the theory debate.
Sure, yeah.
Without the RBI.
Without the RBI, right.
Right. And so offense on the theory debate can come in one of three flavors. One is that you introduce a new shell and weigh it. Right? Mm-hmm. Two is that you win that their interp is actually a counter-interp and that your counter-interp is actually an interp, which means the best case scenario for them, they win the theory debate, but the theory debate's not a reason to vote for them anymore.
Sure.
And three is arguments like the RVI. Mm-hmm. I guess there's also a fourth flavor, and that would be impact turning theory.
Oh, theory bad, or like, yeah.
Theory bad, or theory causes more unfairness, or things like that.
Sure.
Yeah. So those arguments are a little bit less popular right now. I'm not too sure why. I mean, I guess I understand the perspective that those are just usually not very good arguments, but I don't know. I'm open to them. I think they make a lot of sense sometimes. Regardless, that's not the conversation we're going to have right now. The conversation we're going to have right now is what makes something an interp, what makes something a counterinterp.
Sure.
Okay? Mm-hmm. So I think that this discussion would happen best if I read a bunch of arguments on the AFC debate for why AFC Bad is a counterinterp, not an interp. So just to refresh your memory, usually when somebody reads AFC in the AF, they say the neg cannot contest the ethical framework for the debate.
Sure.
So they put a prohibition on what the neg can do.
Okay.
Now, when people read AFC Bad, they say either neg may be able to contest ethical framework, or neg, or
the AF must allow the neg.
Yeah, AF must allow neg to contest ethical framework.
Sure.
Or they make reasons why, like, AF can, neg must be able to challenge ethical framework. Or something like neither debater can put limitations on the framework debate. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to read reasons why AFC Bad's a counterinterp. And the reason this is really important, because if AFC Bad is a counterinterp and you're negating and you read a framework, then you have to fight through the AFC debate to get access to your framework.
Right, yeah, not just to win the round.
Not just to win the round. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm ready whenever you are.
Yes.
For you guys following along at home, please flow this, take some prep time, then respond to these arguments and compare your responses to Kirk's, and then incorporate my feedback and redo the drill until you get it perfect. Ready?
Yeah.
AFC Bad is a counterinterpretation, one key to ensure that I can leverage the AFC shell and the AF against the neg. Otherwise, they can always uplayer me with no risk specific interps and force me to restart the theory debate in the 1AR. 2 ensures logical consistency because their interp only shows that AFC is a bad norm, but not why having to respond to AFC shell creates abuse. Theory against AFC only proves that the neg can but not must read a framework. Their interp is inherently permissive in a counterinterpretation loop. AFC advances two claims. First, AF may choose a standard for the debate, and second, negative may not contest the affirmative's choice. The first plank is a counterinterpretation. It is a statement of what the affirmative is allowed to do. The second plank is unique to AFC and obviously an offensive theory argument. Counterinterpretation of the second plank will state that the negative may contest the affirmative's framework. End quote. Thus, negs must show that responding to false theory skews neg strategy to generate offense on AFC, i.e. it must win in RVI. 3. Necessary side constraint on counterinterpretations that they can only be met, not violated. The fact that the one end can violate the interp put forth by the 1AC is indicative that I am prohibiting one end practices, which makes AFC an interp, not a counterinterpretation. So, take some prep time, and then let's hear what you got. Alright, for those of you following along at home, Kirk just took some prep time and is going to respond to the arguments that were just read. Hopefully you took some prep time as well and gave a speech and recorded yourself, and now you can compare your speech to this one.
It's going to be pretty short, but it's going to be long, guy.
Okay.
Ready?
Yeah.
Point number one is non-sequitur ensuring AFC as ran doesn't mean it justifies why you have an interpretation. Second, begs the question of why AFC is a good norm. If I win AFC as a bad norm, that means that we shouldn't try to ensure AFC as ran. You're on your second argument, you're on Lou evidence. You say you say there's an interpretation to the first. Your first plank is a counter interpretation because your first plank says that affirmative may choose the standard for debate. However, this means that my interpretation, my AFC bad argument is actually my interpretation because I say that I must not choose the standard for debate, which is prohibiting you from doing something which I'm actually interpretation at worst. Both of us have interpretations. There's no rule that says once one debater runs an interpretation, then other debater runs counter interpretation, which means that we both get offense on theory. We win the argument. They cross by this to your number 3 argument. Also, your number 3 argument doesn't make sense. There is no I also asked as a violation for my shell, which means that we both asked violations at worst. We both asked offense.
Cool. Okay, I think the one argument you missed, that was almost perfect. I'm impressed. I think the one argument you missed is the non-unique on key to ensuring that I can leverage the first argument, because you should say that, like, if I don't get, like, if it's a counter interp for me, you can always read a no risk specific interp and force me to restart the debate, or force me to be in a nib starting in the one end. Right? So basically pointing out that I poorly worded that argument, but essentially what I'm saying is pointing out that the first argument is basically a fairness-based concern for why it should be a counter-interpretation.
What is the exact argument that...
The argument is that otherwise you'll always uplayer me with no-risk specific interps and force me to restart the theory debate in the 1AR if I don't have AFC as an offensive interp in the 1AC. So that way, basically the argument is the 1AR would have to win AFC and the case debate.
Right.
If the neg challenges.
Sure.
But the point is that the AFC is not to challenge. So if you challenge, I should not have to restart the theory debate in the 1AR. Now, my non-unique is that, look, this is a fairness-based concern for why AFC should be, AFC good should be an interpretation, but there's also a fairness-based concern for why AFC bad should be an interpretation.
Oh, yeah, oh, that makes sense, yeah. And I had to win both the interpretation and also win my case offense, too.
Right, exactly. So the logic cuts both ways.
Yeah.
Which gives more weight to your non sequitur argument, that this doesn't justify what's an interp or a counter interp. Now, the next thing I want to do with you is I want to go through the difference between all these justifications, right? The first one is a maximizing fairness-based appeal.
Wait, give me a sec. Okay, yeah.
So the first justification was a maximizing fairness-based appeal. Another argument we've heard for this is the recourse argument that Jackson made in the 2NR against Varun.
Yeah, Jackson made reciprocity and recourse. Like, I thought those were really good arguments, so like I remember them. I probably should write them down.
You probably should write them down and create a file on this. So the recourse argument was that in a world where I'm stuck with the counterinterpretation, or no, it's in a world where you get offensive counterinterpretations. There's no incentive for me to read theory because I can lose on it. Makes no sense,
Oh.
and that destroys recourse.
Oh, I thought the argument was that if I don't have offense, I don't have offense on theory against your AC theory spikes, i.e., I always access a counterinterpretation. There's no incentive for me to read theory. It's not that Varun's argument.
Oh, right. You're right. Because he was saying, because Varun said in the 1AR that this shell that Jackson read was an OCI.
Yeah, OCI.
Right. Okay. Wait, what? Really? Varun said that?
Probably not. I probably said it was a counterinterp. Yeah. I don't think.
I don't think Varun would have said it's an OCI because
that would.
the tuner would have just been like, "Cool, all right, sounds good."
Yeah.
I think Varun said that his argument was an OCI.
Really?
That his counter interp on the spikes on the CX checks debate was an OCI. Because remember, the 1AR read a new shell and then also read a counter interp. His argument was that the counter interp is an OCI. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Wait, but the way Jackson phrased the reciprocity argument definitely doesn't make sense. That just means that you'll be the only one accessing offense on theory, and I don't have offense on theory. Clearly, Jackson does. I think we need to release it.
Right. So for you guys following along at home, I think it's worth your time to type into YouTube Brentwood JL versus Torrey Pines VB and watch that 2015 TOC round five debate and see specifically what we're discussing. We're going to do the same, and we'll have it ready for our redos next time. So that's. But the bigger picture here was that there are fairness-based concerns for why something is an offensive interp or a counter-interp.
Sure.
And also if it's an interp versus a counter-interp. It's not just offensive counter-interp versus not like normal counter-interp, but also if it's an interp versus a counter-interp. I think the next category of arguments here are logic. Like consistency with logic. And so the logic here would be a counterinterp is permissive, an interp is prohibitive.
Sure.
Another way you could phrase it is that there would be no way to make the interp in such a way that it did not include a not or a cannot.
Wait, what?
So interp says you cannot do this, or you should not have done that, right? Another way to have a litmus test for if it's an interp or not is whether or not you can phrase it in such a way that it does not have a prohibition.
Okay.
So to expand a little bit on that litmus test, let's say your opponent read a nib, right? And you're responding to the nib. And so if you're responding to the nib, you cannot create an interp that would not be you cannot read a nib in some way, shape, or form. The only way I could possibly think of something that you could, like a possible way you could do that would be saying like you can read a nib if and only if the following conditions are met.
Sure.
But then presumably the violation is that the conditions were not met.
Right.
So the conclusion then is you cannot read a nib.
Right.
Right? So that's a great example of how the defining characteristic, i.e. for logical consistency, we have to figure out what is the defining characteristic for an interp and what is the defining characteristic for a counterinterp to maintain logical consistency. So the defining characteristic for an interp is that it cannot be written in such a way that it is not prohibitive. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is really important. This is a nuanced distinction that a lot of debaters do not understand, nor do they draw in round. Now, you also need to impact logical consistency. Do we care more about fairness-based concerns, like maximizing fairness in terms of who gets the interp, who gets the counterinterp, or do we care more about maintaining logical consistency? So this would go back to like the constitutive nature of what makes an interp versus a counterinterp versus pragmatic benefits, right? Additionally, you could make reasons why abiding by the constitutive nature of what is an interp and what is a counterinterp is pragmatically beneficial. The best argument I can think of is norming. That ensuring logical consistency is great for norm development. Because it keeps people moving in the right direction in terms of the theory debate. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Wait, why? Why does logical consistency mean that they move in the right direction? What's
Because
the
if
impact of not moving?
your version, if how you're making the like what if your decision of what is an interp and not a counterinterp is logically inconsistent, then it is basically backwards progress, right? Like we have made progress by figuring out what makes something an interp versus a counterinterp, and you are going backwards now by denying that progress.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
And so there's like several norming warrants here. The A point would be that like when debaters watch you or when debaters debate you or when judges watch you, if you're logically consistent with what makes an interp versus a counterinterp, eventually that spreads over the community.
Okay.
Whereas if you're logically inconsistent, that also spreads. And winning incentivizes people to make those arguments. So if logically inconsistent practices are winning, then norming is harmed significantly. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's one warrant. I think another warrant for why logical consistency is key to norming is that when people read logically inconsistent positions, they themselves believe their logically inconsistent position, which means that they will have the likelihood of propagating that in future debates, meaning that the impact is aggregated.
Yeah, sure.
That's not super distinct from the first argument I just brought up, though.
I think the first argument is more like other debaters.
It's just a spillover argument.
Yeah, sure.
Like when we talk about util impacts, we talk about spillover a lot, right? Like this is the same argument.
Yeah.
So it's a difference between spillover towards the community and spillover into your own mindset in future debates.
Sure.
Notice also how we're making a ton of psychological claims here without psychological warrants.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're basically just playing gods of the LD community right now and explaining what everyone will and will not do, which seems to be a flaw with the norming argument.
Sure.
Cool. I think the other last thing that should be noted here that was really smart of you was pointing out that worst case scenario, we both get interp, counterinterp. Well, we both get access to it being an interp.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Like the last argument you made.
Yeah.
That like this means worst case scenario for me.
Yeah, I see you nodding your head while I was making that argument. So I was like, oh, I'm probably making a good argument.
Yeah. Because if I say explicitly that necessary side constraint on counterinterps is that they can only be met, not violated, right? Then you can say, look, like my counterinterp can be violated, which indicates it's not a counterinterp.
Yeah, sure.
Pretty simple. Yeah. That means we both have an interp. And the winner of the AFC Good Bad debate is the winner of the theory debate.
Sure. Yeah.
Does that make sense? Okay. The last note I want to leave you with is perceptually, it is always to your advantage to phrase your counterinterp as an interp. Always, always, always. It is always worth making a quick one-sentence argument that is offensive that is this interp is offensive. Force your opponent to identify that what you said is really a counterinterpretation and it is not offensive.
So like when you're responding to the theory shell, interpretation, right?
Like if you're reading a nib and your opponent says you cannot read a nib, I would read like I would say we're going to respond to his theory shell, and we're going to just start at his interpretation, right? And I would say something like, so I would just say something like, my interpretation. So notice how instead of saying my counterinterpretation or counterinterpretation, I said my interpretation. My interpretation is that you cannot prohibit the negative from reading one necessary but insufficient burden if it, etc. Insert conditions here.
Yeah, this means an offensive counterinterpretation because I prohibit you from a practice. Yeah.
On the violation, I would say, so I would do that on the violation. So like, let's say the condition is we read a nib and we were willing to grant artificial sufficiency in cross-examination and we didn't turn the F, right? So I would say, my interpretation is that the affirmative may not prohibit the negative from reading a necessary but insufficient burden if A, the negative was willing to grant artificial sufficiency in cross-examination, and B, the negative did not turn the AC. The violation is you read necessary but insufficient burden theory in the 1AR. There's no way for you to wiggle out of this violation. This interpretation is offensive. Standards.
Wait, can you repeat the violation again? Sorry.
Yeah. The violation is you read necessary but insufficient bad theory in the 1AR. There's no way for you to wiggle out of this. Come the 2AR. This is an offensive interp.
Sure.
Now, force them to identify why it's not offensive.
Sure. And then worst case scenario, you lose the argument, but that doesn't mean you lose the theory debate.
Right.
Like if you win the argument, then that means that it's like you get theory offense.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, that's smart. That's smart. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the place where this can get a little bit confusing and perhaps not strategic is if you're also going for an RVI.
Oh, right.
Because presumably RVIs are offense back to a counterinterp. But if your thing is now phrased as an interp, there's no counterinterp to get offense back to.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Right?
Uh-huh.
So the way you can get around that is you can say, on the RVI debate, you can say, you're probably wondering why I'm reading an RVI, given that I didn't have a counterinterpretation. Best case scenario for me that you believe that my interpretation is actually an interpretation, which means that the winner of the theory debate is the winner. The winner of the interp counterinterp debate is the winner of the theory debate. Worst case scenario for me, he is winning that my interpretation is actually a counterinterpretation, in which case the RVI arguments matter.
Uh-huh.
But what that does is A, tip off the judge that you're probably making an illegitimate argument about what is an interp versus a counterinterp,
Right.
and B, like tell your opponent, it reminds your opponent, don't drop the fact that the interp is offensive. Right?
Well, why would you want to remind them? Why wouldn't you want to?
Well, that's what I'm telling you is you don't want to do that.
Oh, right.
So really, then what you need to do, Kirk,
right, yeah.
is you need to choose in a world where you're going for just a counterinterp plus RVI. Don't make your counterinterp offensive.
Okay.
Right? But in a world where you're going for a new shell, make your counterinterp offensive.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And in general, we should shy away from the RVI debate because it's just way too scripted now. Any questions?
Okay. No, I'm good.
Okay, so homework assignment. One is to write out reasons why, basically to script out the OCI bad debate,
Okay.
both from the perspective of fairness and logical consistency and arbitrariness.
OCIs
Second,
good, bad, right? Both sides.
yeah, sure. You can also do the good side.
I'm bringing more homework to myself.
Yeah. I was thinking more just OCI bad. Because we're never going to go for, like, OCIs. We're only going to say it just as a time suck.
Wait, but... Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Right? You're making the argument in the hopes that your opponent drops it and doesn't really deal with it very well.
Oh, yeah, you're not... So can I not do that part?
Yeah, the reason we're not going to go for OCI good is because it's just not a good argument.
Sure, yeah.
There's no need to have that file because I don't want you to ever think that, okay, like I'm going to really sit on OCI's good now.
Yeah.
Right? In general, we should try to avoid sitting on false arguments.
Sure.
Because though you can win that debate, you're fighting an uphill battle, especially against someone good.
And then second, redo the drill.
Yeah. Get it perfect. It was pretty close to perfect, but yeah. Any questions?
No, I'm good.
Does this make a lot more sense to you in terms of the conversation about the difference between OCI and just normal CI?
Sure. Yeah.
Cool. And the last parting note is I really do want to highlight to you the argument that the defining feature of an interpretation is that it cannot be written in such a way that it is not prohibitive.
Yeah, I'll highlight that.
You really need to understand that.